Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another tonic discussion. And just before hitting the record button, we were talking about Peter Singer, the famous utilitarianist, utilitarian philosopher, who recently made headlines with a paper. I guess it wasn't his paper, but like a paper in his journal or something like that, where someone defended bestiality, basically having sex with animals. And it's kind of interesting because that's basically, in that kind of utilitarian thinking, that's where it leads, right? If you think in terms of maximizing well-being, some abstract concept like that, then you start thinking, well, I mean, if people have fun, like having sex with animals, I mean, what's the big deal, right? And so that's kind of like that schizo abstract thought, stripped of all context and of all depth and of all connection to like real experience, that leads to this sort of things. And and this also opens the question, as to differences between humans and animals. uh like, are we like the same morally, or in terms of our like moral worth, moral value? Is there like just a difference in degree between, say, a sheep and a human, or is it like a difference in kind, that sort of thing? And there seems to be a tendency these days to kind of like level the playing field, so to say, and claim that, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, a human is just another animal, right? And therefore, animals and humans, there's not really like a big difference in terms of their moral worth. And you get like some of these extremes in the animal rights movement, where basically, they talk about murder if you kill an animal and things like that, and totally conflate the two spheres. Nonetheless, it's obviously an interesting question, what to make of all that. And just to open the discussion, to my mind, it's like there's no question that, just when you look at what's going on, that there's a fundamental difference between humanity and the animal kingdom, right? It's not just like another animal, maybe with a few different features, but there's real difference in kind. And usually people or say it's the language, our ability for language, for communicating, that is the biggest difference. But that's, I would say, only part of it, or like one of the major expressions of the difference. But there's obviously like a totally different world that we inhabit as human beings, capable of thought, of abstract thought, of long-term planning, of we have a totally there's a whole different world that is open to us as humans, that is not open to animals, right? And we can basically mess things up even more than animals, but we can potentially be also have a much greater experience and a much greater moral worth as well. So I think humans have these two kinds of extremes. We can be much more brutal than any animal could ever be, but we can also be much better, and I would say closer to the divine, in a sense, than an animal can be. So with that being said, sex with animals, difference between humans and animals, what do you guys think?
I'm going to go on the record as saying having sex with animals is wrong. You probably shouldn't do that. And if you're
Yeah.
doing that, you have problems. And probably should not be allowed around animals.
It's a
Maybe
spicy
Um,
take, John.
yeah, I know it's very controversial. I know, but like like just to, I don't know, almost like not devil's advocate, but there is history there. Like Rumi, the Persian poet, had one of his like many sort of racy, salacious stories involved this aristocratic woman who was watching her serving lady getting railed by a donkey, and she kept getting more and more curious about it. Uh, So then one day she goes into the stable and the donkey's like giant member splits her in half, and the serving lady like finds her dead on the floor, and she kind of shakes her head. It's like, oh, you shouldn't have been too embarrassed to ask how I did it. If you'd asked me, I would have told you you have to put a gourd on the end of its penis in order to keep it from going all the way in. The moral of the story being, if you don't know how to do something, ask, I guess. So, like, people have been joking about this kind of thing for a long time. Um, yeah, I just thought that was a funny story. But uh
Jesus.
I don't roomy, man. What can I say? Like what a you're such a perv. Um, but no, I mean, I don't know. I sort of I I think there is a degree in difference in kind between humans and animals. At the same time, there's something of a continuum there, right? I mean, like I'd have a hard time accepting that the moral value of a termite is equivalent to a dog, for example. A dog is okay. Like Mark sort of said before that we were starting recording, he was like, it can't communicate its internal state, but it kind of can. Like it's got facial expressions and it can read human emotions very effectively and will respond to them and so on. And it's
Right,
got a
right.
very
I mean, to be fair, I was cut off because I was going to say that,
yeah, yeah,
what I meant
yeah.
by internal state was like the same sort of state that a human can, in the sense that we can imagine the
Yeah, I
future
mean, a dog,
in a
yeah,
way that an
a dog,
animal cannot. It can't imagine future states so much.
no,
But we
it
can
definitely,
certainly, I agree with you that we can certainly read,
yeah, a
to
dog
some
definitely
extent
like
what's on an
lives,
animal's mind.
yeah, it lives like much more in like the present than it does like, it has a very different relationship with time, obviously, which leads to a very different relationship to like morality. But like a dog will still like, protect its owner. It'll still, be tender with children, or its own puppies or what have you. Um, and if I see someone like abusing a dog, I will get really angry about that. If I see someone step on a term, I won't really feel anything, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's sort of like, just to bring it back real quick to the subject of sex with animals. I was thinking, just before we hit record, I was like, wait a minute, the Ayatollah Khomeini had something to say about this. I recall in the little blue book that he released, he had something interesting to say about it. And I found the quote. And the quote is: "A man can have sex with animals such as sheep, cows, camels, and so on. However, he should kill the animal after he has his orgasm. He should not sell the meat to people in his village, but selling the meat to a neighboring village is reasonable." Now let's consider this,
What in the
because I think
actual?
that's an actual quote, yeah, from the little
That's,
blue book, or I think it was called the Green Book. It was like after it was after the revolution. It was post-revolution. It was a very popular book.
I mean, like first, like
Um,
who puts that much thought at that level of detail into this question? And the second, like, how do you the
Yeah,
conclusions?
you can. Yeah, right, right.
Just there's
The
so
meat
much there.
isn't
There's
good
so
enough
much
for
there.
your own village, but it might be good enough for the next village, depending upon that village, I suppose.
Your
So
spunky
it's sort of like,
steaming like mutton
correct,
is perfectly okay to sell to like.
right. And I'm not saying, and by the way, this isn't an assault on Islam or anything like that. It may be, though, an assault on Khomeini and sort of like the modern forms, or I'd say even postmodern forms, because really, like, if we're talking about the revolution, we're talking about a fully postmodern version of Islam. And that, of course, that postmodernism has affected all religions, I think, and really all philosophies, all, materialist, secular, whatever. But what I think is interesting about that is that it made me think of, like, a million years ago. I took a class on artificial intelligence. And the very first thing that we studied, before we studied anything else, was Descartes' theory of automata. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but it's just sort of like, it reminds me that all bad theories are born in the Enlightenment, essentially. Because what what Descartes was getting at with his theory of automata was, he was essentially, he was implying two things. He was saying that, okay, so man can have all of these interior states of analysis and the potential for new things. And that, in a sense, like when we were looking at an animal, what we were seeing was the other part of man, which is more automatic. So it's like sort of like we breathe automatically. We want, like, we're hungry automatically. There are all these sort of complex processes that are going on in our bodies that we're unaware of. And so what he was saying when he's looking at animals is like, well, that's what an animal is. An animal is all of those automated processes minus the human one. And the human one being the one, I guess, that is sort of like you could say it's the conscious will. You could say that it is the analytical process. In other words, he's saying like, okay, so animals are us up until a point, but that point ends at consciousness. And like, I think that if you run the line straight to Khomeini, you will see the same sort of idea, like just kind of being passed along, that animals are not just not us, but that they are essentially only objects for use. And then of course we run into the problem now where we have like almost surreal dickheads like Pete, who are like just saying, who are taking the next logical step and saying like that human beings are also automata to some degree. That human beings ourselves, like it didn't go, the wave didn't go the other way. Like we eventually ended in the territory that we were doomed to from the theory of automata, which essentially was deconstructive, was breaking things down into individual processes rather than kind of gathering all the evidence and constructing it and putting the dots together, so to speak, into like what consciousness was and like what it meant to be a living creature. And so instead you have these weird theories like that are just kind of like spread around that I think nobody believes in, because we have a sense of things that's beyond any sort of domain of knowledge. Like we already know that, like, yeah, no, a goat isn't the same as a man, but like a goat is also like not is not a machine. You know what I mean? And it's just sort of like so again, like you have like this kind of spiraling out of control um sort of pseudo philosophy that was always going to end in, well, everything's a machine, so everything's suitable for every use, but maybe sell it to your neighboring village. Don't contain it within your own sphere. Now we've discarded the idea of neighboring villages too, and I think below that is just kind of a bottomless pit, and I think that that's what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, I mean, so long as we're talking about the Ayatollah's fatwa regarding goat sex and meat sales, what does the FDA have to say on the subject? What is the allowable percentage of meat packing
Semen
plants
and goat meat?
semen in ground beef?
They've got top men working on it.
So
No,
so
you were.
John,
Oh, go ahead. Harrison, sorry.
Grant's
earlier,
face right now. He's just like, I don't think
yeah, he's gonna bow out from this. So John, you earlier you mentioned the word like schizo-autistic, I think, about this kind of philosophy. So the philosophies have I think you can to simplify the problem with a lot of these philosophies is that they take a vastly kind of overly simplistic view of nature in general and human nature in particular, and so there's kind of a flattening that happens. So I think this is what Mark was getting at with like Descartes. So Descartes kind of split nature into two, and then the progression of philosophy and thought since then has been like, oh well, the part that was actually human has like, oh well, we can't rationally and logically justify that part, and so we're left with just the automaton, just the automata.
Right, and the human part kind of gets like it shrinks and it's gotten smaller and smaller over time. Right.
So now we're just all automatons. But so there seems to be kind of two equally schizo-autistic but at odds views of this topic. And so the one would be, if you look at like the PETA people, it's like everything is equal, everything's the same, and everything has equal value. So killing an animal is murder, and animals, including cockroaches, are on the same the same plane as humanity. And then you've got the opposite but equally flat notion that human value and human life is the only thing with value, and that everything else, like in the animal kingdom, is totally devoid of value. So that we might see humans as special, but that the animal world and nature in general has zero value except as a utilitarian thing to be used and exploited in some degree. So I think that both are wrong, but that it's the goal should be kind of to avoid those extremes and to avoid those extreme oversimplifications of nature, because like you're saying, John, when you see someone beating a dog for no reason, or for just the reason of beating a dog, then that in any kind of like functioning human, that activates some kind of moral sense, like, no, that, you know, I want to beat that person, right? Like there's the influence or the impulse to stop that person and to punish him from doing something that's reprehensible. So there's like if we look at the like killing animals, there's a similar question in terms of like killing humans. Like, what's the difference between what we would say like killing or a justifiable killing and murder? Like every human culture seems to make some kind of distinction on that, like a justified versus an unjustified killing of another human being. And it seems like that probably applies to animals as well. The rules that we function by might be like different. The categories and the criteria that we apply to such situations will be different, but the same general rule applies, in that there are circumstances where killing an animal would be justified, and where it's seen as some kind of like pathological deviation from normal the normal expression of a human. And so, and we have a natural aversion to that type of thing. Like if you look at well, not just serial killers, but like psychopaths in general, they tend to abuse and kill animals as children, and in a very sadistic way. It's like just maybe just because they like it, they're curious, and they'll, you know, the family will buy puppies, and the puppies will mysteriously die and disappear. Cats in the neighborhood will be killed. Was it I think it was Dahmer? Who was the guy with the glasses that was
Jeffrey
kind of
Dahmer.
weird? Was that Dahmer?
The guy who
Yeah,
ate people? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But there's because I'm pretty sure it was him. But I'm thinking of the comic book. What was the name of the comic book? It was made into a movie. But there was this guy who went to school with, I believe it was Dahmer, in like high school, and so he wrote this comic book about growing up in high school with Dahmer, and how, you know, they had no idea. They knew he was kind of weird. They made fun of him, but they kind of hung out with him because he was so weird. They thought he was kind of like just a funny guy to hang out with and make fun of just because he was so weird. But, you know, he'd go out to his shed, and I think his dad even found in the shed all these body parts that he'd preserved from animals. So he'd go out there just to experiment and kill different types of animals. And but it was a pathological expression of killing animals. Like, it wasn't the way that humans ordinarily and have ordinarily killed animals for, you know, our entire history. There was something weird about it. So all that is just to say that I think that to reconcile to avoid either of those extremes is to impart some kind of value to animals, like on a scale, but not to the same degree as with humans. But then there's a question, because this is one that I'm torn over, because like Luke asked in the introduction, is it just a difference of degree, or is it a difference in kind? Now, I would, like, immediately in my mind, I would say, oh, it's a difference in kind, you know, that humans in general are on a different level than animals. But at the same time, I'm torn, because I can think, is there ever a case where a particular animal might have more value than a particular human? I'm not speaking in terms of like all humans or, you know, or even groups of humans, but a single human. So
I
basically what
have
I'm
no
asking is,
trouble. I have no trouble answering that in the affirmative. You know,
right.
like,
Yeah. 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 Me too.
you know, like, you know, if I have
Hillary
like,
Clinton.
right, like if it's a choice between Jeffrey Dahmer and my dog, I'm
Right.
choosing my dog. You know, like that's not, and I'm not going to hesitate on that. You know,
So
um,
does so is it like so well in the terms of like degree and kind, is it the case of overlapping kinds, you know, and where the degrees kind of morph at some point and overlap at some point? Like how do you conceptualize that like in a more kind of general framework?
You
well,
say that the
it's a matter of looking at the relationships. I think as like the key element rather than the entity in some kind of like isolated sense, right? So like, you know, someone else's dog, I'm not going to like value that dog over sort of like a random human, right? But like
Mhm.
my dog, I probably will put a higher value on that than I would on like some random human on the other side of the planet that I've never met, you
But
know?
what
what
about Jeffrey
about
Dahmer in particular? So would you value another person's dog over Jeffrey Dahmer? Like I probably would.
yeah. Well,
But
I
Yeah,
wouldn't
no,
say, you know, there's like a question of like moral
I
culpability where
wouldn't.
you wouldn't assign that with a dog. Like if a dog does kill somebody, you know, maybe the dog's or whatever you call it, just like a vicious dog and attacks a kid, you know, you would say put the dog down, but
Yeah.
right?
you wouldn't think like, oh,
Well,
this
we're
is just
talking
this
about
evil
abstractions,
dog,
though.
and unless it was your kid, maybe then you'd take revenge on the dog. But if it was like just a random, you know, thing where the dog attacks a kid and you would just euthanize the dog, but with like Jeffrey
Yeah,
Dahmer, there's this
Yeah.
idea. This is a bad person. Like he went bad and did these terrible things. It's like a
yeah,
conscious moral
I mean,
agent, and so
but
he placed
to,
himself
to
below
my
the
mind,
level of a
to my
dog by doing
to
that.
my to my mind, like the end result though is actually it leads to the same place. You know, it's like what do you do with a Jeffrey Dahmer when you find him?
Yeah, but the
Uh,
thing is, I
I
think we
say
still,
like you know you kill him, like you put him out of his misery, and like you know like you would a mad dog. Like there's not
yeah,
really
but I think that there's still a like we apply different criteria, right, to humans. I think I wanted actually to make the same point as Daniel just did, because the thing is, you know, if a human just goes, you know, does something like really stupid or horrible or whatever, we won't like say, okay, just kill the guy, you know, like on the spot, right? With a dog, it's sort of what we do, and with a human, we usually, you know, give the benefit of the doubt, or like first try to, you know, like understand what's going on. I mean, we might eventually end up, you know, with John's solution, you know, but it might take time, right? We will have to be sure that this is really like a horrible person, you know, and there must be like a repeat. There must be an observation, you know, that over maybe longer periods of time. So I think even in that case, we can see that we do make kind of a difference between an animal and a human being, right? But it's and also I wanted to make the point, you know, not speaking of morality for a moment, but just, you know, the basic observation that, you know, differences between humans and animals, right? So it's hard to just, you know, like gloss over that, you know, even apart from the question of moral worth. So that's really like I find really strange, you know, with those, you know, as Harrison said, with this other extreme of animal activists who basically pretend there's just no difference, right? I mean, we just maybe a little bit smarter or whatever. So yeah, even just on the phenomenological level, it doesn't really make much sense. Yeah, but I mean, you guys are right, and I think Harrison's question was pretty good. I mean, it's like, yeah, it's not as simple as, you know, like an animal has X worth and a human has Y worth, right? I mean, we do kind of value our dogs more than some random psycho, you know. That's for sure.
Well, let me just say, I've been thinking about what all of you guys have been saying, and I like the entire time, like Silence of the Lambs is playing in my mind. So let me try to define the extremes, because I think the extremes could be found in that scene, in that famous scene where Clarice is describing the screaming of the lambs. because again, like if you've ever heard a lamb scream, they really do sound human. Like from a distance, the ear, it's very difficult to pick up the difference between a young lamb who's being slaughtered or in some way, harassed or whatever, and a human child. And so in that scene, Clarice, on the one hand, is like, again, like this is a fair use of animals, right? They're slaughtering the spring lambs for meat for human beings. And this is something that we consider moral to do. And I consider it moral to do. And so like, but Clarice in her emotional, she anthropomorphizes these creatures. Even if it's just at a distance, but when she gets close, she already knows these aren't humans. And yet she tries to free them. She tries to free them from their fate. And so Hannibal Lecter, like being the exact opposite, the psychopath of psychopaths, he looks at this and he relishes it because he understands, in his understanding of it, Clarice has misunderstood, not just like the subject of lambs, but the subject of all life, which is all, again, machine-based, is all automata, is all something to be used for pleasure or at a whim even. And so you have these two kind of archetypal like extremes at each other that are faced together. And I agree with you guys that like the truth lies somewhere in between those extremes. But as a Christian, and again, if I have any right to call myself a Christian, I would say this. I would say that I would not kill a man who is at my mercy ever. And that is a line I would never cross. And that is something and that means Jeffrey Dahmer, yes. It means basically anyone who is at my mercy. If Jeffrey Dahmer's coming at me or Jeffrey Dahmer's coming at my dog, he's fair game. That's the self-defense principle. And I believe that as well. But like, there's no way that a man who is bound and chained at my mercy, I would kill. That's not the same as an animal. And like, that is the line.
To me, that comes down to a question of, is death the worst thing? And I think like that there's kind of a broad consensus in our society that there's nothing worse than death. There's this horror of death, trying to avoid it for as long as we can, and so on. And in our penal system, with the exception of a few states in the U.S., the death penalty has been more or less eliminated. But I mean, personally, I'm not so sure that's the case. I mean, like, okay, so take the example of the dog. You have a mad dog, it bites someone. And now it's at your mercy, like it can't attack you or whatever. So what do? Do you throw it in the basement and turn the lights out for the rest of its life? I mean, that sounds you can't let it run around the street because it's going to bite people again. It's already demonstrated that.
I agree with the dog. I agree about the dog. The dog you can put down.
I mean, I look at someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, and I just have the same reaction. And like, I don't really consider him human. That's kind of an element of it too. Like, I think internally, like his soul is not human, something like that. But like locking him up in a cell for the rest of his natural life strikes me as an elaborate and extraordinarily sadistic form of torture, which I actually consider to be like more dehumanizing to the torturers than simply removing the problem. In addition to being far more expensive, I mean, like a bullet is like pennies, whereas you're spending $200,000 a year to lock this guy up in maximum security institution. But that's kind of a utilitarian argument. To me, the moral argument is the main thing there, which is like, what is actually more merciful to do, right? Is like putting this thing out of its misery or torturing it, psychological torture for the rest of its life.
Well, what I find is a useful heuristic is if utilitarianism somehow lines up well with like what you want to do anyway, and also seems to line up well with mercy, then it's time to really take a hard look at the model. Like the way that I see life is trade-offs. And like the idea that like something can like somehow agree across so many multiple levels strikes me as dangerous territory. It's like, it's true. Like everything that you say, I agree with. It's true.
it can also mean that, like, things are just kind of like aligning in like kind of like the most practical and the most moral direction. I mean,
It could
to
be.
edge off from like um the death penalty, which is rather fraught, to something maybe a little bit less fraught, like lesser offenses like theft or things like that, where we would imprison someone for some period of time, right? And we consider this to be this is the moral thing to do because we're trying to rehabilitate them, but we're also trying to punish them. Everyone kind of gets that having like several years of your life taken away, locked in an institution, is absolutely a horrible form of punishment. And we have this
The
idea that
question, though,
but we have this idea that this is like more moral than corporal punishment, right? That simply taking someone who's been convicted of a crime behind the courthouse and whipping him or throwing him in the stocks or whatever, right? Something which is really painful and is over in 10 minutes. And then, okay, you've paid the price. Back into society you go. Don't do that again. We somehow we consider that to be barbaric, and
I didn't use the word barbaric. That's not the
no,
reason.
you didn't.
Like
You didn't. I'm just saying, like, society in general considers like corporal punishment of that form, which our civilization used up until like a century ago, to be this kind of barbaric atavism. But I sort of look at that and I'm like, well, that punishment is paid quickly. It's over with. The person can go back into society. There's good reason to think they've probably learned their lesson because it's hard to forget getting whipped or caned or something like that.
so I think part of the lesson,
and you haven't stolen several years of their life, which they can never get back. The time is the one thing which is irreplaceable. And
well, maybe
yeah,
as far as we know.
Well, yeah,
Not to mention
like,
that this doesn't even rehabilitate them. They go into prison. I mean, it's like the conditions are so bad that it's like
Well, Dahmer was just killed in prison.
Barbaric.
Well, right.
Dahmer was just killed in prison. Here's another guy who's in prison right now. There's a guy named Derek Chauvin who was just knifed 20 times by an FBI agent, essentially, while he was in the law library. Okay.
Yeah.
So to get back into like
the Czech leader of a Mexican drug cartel knifing Derek Chauvin because of Black Lives Matter.
So let me explain the practical. Correct. So let me explain the practical part of my argument. Because again, like I think that in the story of Jesus Christ, we have multiple levels of education that are happening. There are multiple lessons being taught. And one of the lessons in his execution is that once you empower anyone to do that, to kill someone who is at their mercy, there will be mission creep. It may start with Dahmer, but it will not end with him. And if you gentlemen believe, as I do, that Derek Chauvin, for example, is essentially a scapegoat for empire, and I believe that he is. I'm not comparing him to Jesus Christ. But what I'm saying is that like when we empower that ability in others, even though we claim it to ourselves, we say like, well, I may kill Jeffrey Dahmer, but other people may not. Okay, fine. What have you set up? Like, what kind of a system are you exactly building there? What are you encouraging by saying that? And to bring it back to the subject of animals, it's sort of like there is no court of animals, right? Like John says, a mad dog can be put down. Of course, a mad dog can be put down. You could say that a mad dog should be put down. But a mad human, like once we empower that in like institutional authorities, we really might be setting ourselves up for our own demise. Like literally,
there is, you can push back on that and go the other way. It's like that if you start to bring this element of mercy, well, we can't do these certain things. We must, have this mercy on these violent criminals. Then mission creep goes the other way towards what we have the Soros DAs, like, it's unjust, to put them to punish them at all. We just need to treat them as mercifully as possible, hamstring the police as much as possible, so the police can't possibly violate any of their rights, and they need to have their dignity preserved, and then they just get turned back out on the street. And now, instead of the criminals getting treated this way, it's like they're free to then victimize just regular people in the community, and then everybody has this dysfunctional society where nobody can be secure in their persons or their home or their property or whatever.
There's no question those people are insane, though.
But
there's no question those people are insane. They're insane, and they're actually their insanity is ultimately self-destructive. They're destroying the city that I live in. Like I go back and forth about what I should do, because like there's a part of me that's sort of like, it's like, oh, great, I have front row seats at like Leviathan in his latest experiments. And then there's another part of me that just says, fucking run. But like the idea here is that like the ways of punishment, right? Like I agree. Like first of all, like the what Daniel says is absolutely correct. I'm just not sure if it's a natural outgrowth of, say, something like, I do not have the right to kill someone at my mercy. Like that seems like at my mercy is the most important part of that. I'm not saying you don't have the right to kill someone who is presenting an active threat. But like, what does it do when we empower?
As an active threat, though. I mean, you have some people. It's just this is just a.
Let's put it this way. Maybe I have the right,
no matter where they are, to whoever's around them. And so then at that point,
I literally do have the right to kill Jeffrey Dahmer if I see him in the street. In the sense that if I have the means to do it, I can do it. And that's on me. That's on my soul. That is something that I will have to deal with. When we outsource it to an authority, to experts like the police, to experts like the courts, that's where it starts to become tricky.
Yeah, but
because it's just, I can kill, and that is my sin. No, but like if we outsource,
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something there, Mark, because that's basically what I wanted to say too, because I think the problem is when we're discussing these things, I mean, it's not really a big practical help, but I think the problem is that we think in terms of systems, right? Of basically like technocratic institutions and courts and rules, and that's part of the issue, I think, because we can go on, forever about like which rule is true. Should we, in case X, should we kill person Y, or should the rule be we should never kill unless self-defense? And these are all like abstract rules, and I think
that's what I mean. It's my rule. It's my rule. It's my own rule.
That's if you speaking about yourself, then it's obviously not just an abstract rule, because then your soul is involved. But I think we probably should think of these about this stuff more in terms of like a community, like a small community where you have like a chieftain or whatever, and the community kind of things in each individual case, like what is the best course of action here, right? And you can imagine all kinds of situations where this or that might be appropriate, and you won't have this mission creep in either direction, right? Because it's like an organic thing. Because I can think of examples where it would be absolutely warranted to just kill somebody who's like wrecking your whole community, and perhaps even if we think of maybe there is no way to imprison the guy, I mean, what do you do then? I mean, it's like drive him out maybe, but if that is not a feasible solution. So I mean, it's like morality and these kinds of questions are just very local, very organic, and very specific in like, you have to look at the whole context, right? And that's part of the problem, when we discussing about the death penalty and stuff, because you can always like come up with situations and whatever, but the problem is that this technocratic organization of the justice system, right? And in that, like something like the death penalty, it doesn't fit, right? Because it's like, how can you make general rules, about life and death? It's just something that is really like almost impossible.
I think you can, and I think it's actually really important for any, especially like large society, really any society, there have to be like sort of understood general rules, right? Because if you don't have that, then you'll start to have the perception of sort of arbitrary decisions and favoritism and special treatment and such, which then engenders resentment and starts to break things down. People are very sensitive, even like small children are extremely sensitive to fairness. Kind of the idea that a basic rule is being applied to everyone, and it's being applied in an even-handed fashion. That said, if that becomes inflexible, that's when you start to run into like tyranny and of another kind. So you need both, is kind of the point that I'm getting at. Like, you need to have those general rules, but you need to have those rules implemented by people who are able to exercise human discretion to like look at the actual specifics of the situation and recognize when, maybe the like it fulfills all of the like checks all the boxes for some kind of punishment, but actually given other extenuating circumstances, maybe you kind of look the other way or you show some mercy or whatever, right? And if you take out that human element, you just have this kind of purely technocratic machine law, then it becomes intolerable. But if you get rid of the law entirely, you pretty much end up with warlordism.
Isn't there a bit of a contradiction? Because before you were saying, like, you were kind of almost saying it was almost a mercy in order to kill a Dahmer because he's not even human. So it's just sort of like, so is it punishment or mercy? Like, what are we really talking about?
Yeah, I mean,
like,
okay,
it's just sort of like, you can't have it both ways. You can't say like, well, it's torture to keep him in a cage forever. What?
I mean, it is.
Like, say
I'm saying it's like, on one hand, you're saying that it's torture to keep him in a cage forever, but on the other hand, then you're saying like it's a mercy. It's that somehow it's also a punishment, because I do think punishment is important. Like, I'm not abandoning the concept of punishment.
It absolutely is, but this is like it's like, I mean, so if we're talking about death penalty, usually that's applied to like murder or something, right? So you can imagine the legal system that says like, well, if you're convicted of murder,
I mean, he will die eventually. He will die. He will die eventually in custody. Right. He did. Right. Other people have died.
Mark, stop cutting me off. So what I'm saying is, like, you need to have that human element in the decision making process, where like you like, say you have the death penalty for murder, for example, but you got like judges who are able to sort of like look at it, the specifics of it, and sort of say, well, maybe in this particular instance, actually, this was, a justified killing, or there are extenuating circumstances, so we're not actually going to kill you specifically, even though we could. You basically, you have to have an avenue for mercy in the system. Mercy being the suspension of judgment, right? Being like, this rule could be, this law could be applied to you, this punishment could be applied to you, but we're not going to, right?
But at the lower level,
it's like, like say like, you're in a polity that has like really strict drug laws, and like, on like technically according to the books, if you're caught with like an ounce of marijuana, you could go to jail for 10 years or something, right? And then like, the cop catches some teenager with like a baggie of weed, and like kind of like takes the weed away, throws it into the bush, tells the kid to go home, doesn't book him because like he doesn't want to ruin the kid's life. Like, he's exercising that level of discretion, showing mercy. Whereas if you had the kind of the purely technocratic system with the cops walking around, he's got like a permanent live feed from like a body cam that he's wearing, goes in. It sends everything to like the AI, and the AI just kind of says, "Oh, yep, we detected like 10 years in jail."
But John, the thing is, what usually happens in technocratic societies, which basically is like you get automatically if you erect these kinds of justice systems, right? Is that you actually you don't have a human authority that can suspend rules. Rather, you come up with ever new rules, right? So if it's less than 3 grams, then it's okay. Or like in the case of, like there's a mercy clause if X, Y, is the case, and stuff like that. And it all gets like more convoluted, and it can also lead to like basically anarchy if like the laws get like scaled back. And because people say, oh, yeah, so there were a bunch of people who were received the death penalty, you know, which were unlawfully, and so now we scale back. And so it's like really what you want to have is like, you know, the village sheriff kind of type, you know, like back in the days, that can say like, oh yeah, I know this guy, you know, like I know his background, and I know he, you know, his wife died last year, and yeah, I should probably, by law, I should put him in jail now because he did something, but yeah, I give him a chance. I know he won't do that, you know, probably again. So that sort of thing, right, where you can actually like
have
like
that's exactly what I'm describing.
Yeah,
that's exactly
I
what I'm
know.
describing.
So,
it's like you're having that human element there, and like, because like, yeah,
but like almost like a totalitarian human element, right, which can like dole out law on the spot, so to say, right, like the village sheriff, you know, who can basically be the law.
But
I'm not saying
this is what I was getting at, Luke. Like I was saying, like maybe I was a member of a posse, like in the 19th century, and I'm riding hard to like find these villains and these outlaws, and yeah, I'm going to shoot. Like I'm going to shoot on sight, perhaps. You know, these are horse thieves, and they're shooting back. Or maybe I even shoot before they shoot at me. But again, like this is my decision. In other words, like it would be my sin. Like in other words, it's mine to decide in a strange way. Like that's how it's different than animals.
You're not displacing it into like or a different mark from like the technocracy, right? Like you're not like displacing it into the system, like saying, oh, like
I'm saying that the technocratics,
there's no more. You're not saying like, oh, there's like no moral culpability on me for the actions because it was the system that did it. I'm just acting on the system's behalf. So
correct, John. That's what I was getting at. I'm moving the responsibility to myself.
I think that's very important, actually, because I think like only when you accept that responsibility for your own actions can those actions
I may do it
in principle, you know, and frankly you're more likely to be merciful if you're kind of taking it on your own soul, right? But just quickly go back to the kind of village totalitarianism, because I find that interesting. Those sort of societies, like the village sheriff, right? Like, I mean, he's got a lot of latitude and he can maybe be a bit of a tyrant depending, but I mean, it's not arbitrary. Like everyone kind of understands that, you know, for instance.
No, I mean, yeah, for sure. And yeah.
Like, you know, if you get caught cattle rustling, well, you know, that's a hanging offense, right? Or like horse thieving or whatever, hanging offense. Like that, and it's generally understood that that's, you know, that can be done to you for that crime. But like, you know, forgetting to tip the prostitute at the brothel, you know, like that's probably not, you know, if you get hanged for that, people in the village are going to be like, whoa, that's going a little far, and like, you know, then probably you do that enough, and you're going to engender sort of resentment and resistance from the population who are ultimately going to try and push you out. So it isn't like really an absolute power. I mean, there's this kind of like you have to act within the bounds of what is considered acceptable.
There has to be like broadly speaking, a legal framework, and I think this is what you were describing in terms of mercy. Like there are limits to what the law can enforce or do, but and I think that's important, especially in a society that like in societies like ours that aren't small community based. There needs to like I think history has shown that you need a legal framework, but how that legal framework is first structured and then how it is implemented is kind of an open question, and there are various options and ways of putting it into effect. But it's so you have like what is allowed from a like law enforcement perspective, but so there are limits to what the sheriff can do. There are limits placed on the extent of the sheriff's powers, but he also has the capacity and even this could be like enshrined legally, the capacity for mercy, the capacity to exercise his own judgment, to say, well, no, this like you were saying, I could do this in this situation, but given the circumstances, I'm going to choose not to. And so I think that's probably an important. I think that is an important part of just humans living together and trying to solve their own problems. I think that's an important element in in just human interaction, that capacity for that aspect of context and human decision making on the part of the person that everyone kind of agrees, or most people agree, or the vast majority agree, is the person we've kind of given that power. And because I think that's how we operate. We do have that kind of village sheriff mentality for the most part. We say, okay, well, I'm not always going to be the sheriff. Sometimes I am. Sometimes, if the circumstances are
might be a deputy.
There are certain circumstances, right? Yeah, I'm going to self-deputize myself because in the circumstances, that's kind of what the situation requires. And even then, the sheriff can come along and say, "Oh, well, yeah, you did the right thing. In this circumstance, that was the right thing to do. I'm not going to penalize you for taking the law into your own hands, because if I was there, I would have done it." And I understand the circumstances, right? There's a lot of
I just want to be clear, because Harrison, that's important, because I don't want to be misunderstood, as some kind of pussy who's just sort of oh, the state shouldn't execute people. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't outsource morality to the state. And we shouldn't outsource moral decisions to the state and to its experts and to its agents, because I don't trust them, quite frankly.
To move to a higher level. Hold on. To move to a higher level.
Wait. Let me finish my point, because I want to talk about outsourcing because
I'm going to build on that point.
Okay, but let me just finish really quickly, because I want to bring it back to animals for a second. I was thinking about the outsourcing to the grocer, the outsourcing to the butcher, the outsourcing to the agricultural giant that sort of runs this entire distribution network of meat that arrives to us in a form that's not at all like the animal that it came from, that we didn't hunt, that we have no responsibility for. We just outsource everything, even the outsource of the idea of okay, so animals are suitable for our use. I agree. But again, the idea of endlessly outsourcing those moral decisions to entities that are way beyond our local sphere of action, way beyond what we can do directly, right? It's just sort of I see things like the death penalty the same way, in the sense, and just to some degree to the entire idea of organized law enforcement to the same way. I'd be much more comfortable in the sheriff village model, where I deputize or self-deputize, because again, this maps the responsibility back to me. This puts the onus on me to decide. And if I decide wrong, then God will judge me, right? That is the authority system that I am talking about. I am not talking about going through intermediaries up through a scale. I'm saying if I do wrong, and I may do wrong, and I have done wrong, and I will continue to sin in a variety of ways. I will break my oaths, I'm sure. But my point is that they are my oaths, and they are my rules to break. And once I begin to put that onus outside of me and hire people essentially to go and do my dirty work, then I feel I might be an automata. I might be like more in that model of like, okay, well, I'm just out for my own interests and comforts in the moment, and that's it. And like, you know, I'm not willing to cede that ground to Descartes or any fucking body. You know, I am the one who decides. You know, I am the one who knocks. I don't. That's my opinion on it.
Breaking Bad, nice.
I was gonna say, very well said, Mark, because it's like that's what's missing from a lot of this stuff, is like that having skin in the game, and probably a reason why. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of like a unavoidable paradox when people live in these cities and have social arrangements where everything's so impersonal. Because you know, you get these DAs that, let's say, let people off, but they're, which is actually kind of funny now that some of the stories that have come out about either these DAs or family members of the DAs that have been carjacked, for example, you know, it's like, well, the chicken's coming home to roost, but that happens so rarely. And then, of course, people really behind that, the George Soroses of the world, you know, they're above it all, so they can just manipulate everything, you know, like a snake that he is, and not have to deal with, at least not in the here and now, any consequences for unleashing narco tyranny on people. But definitely there's a difference, and this is where you brought up tying that into like factory farming, for example, like how we outsource it to Disney. The difference between like a farmer, a hunter gatherer, like kills an animal and shows some respect for it, for the act of killing, and recognize there's something happening there, versus somebody working in a slaughterhouse. Like I was in the Army with a guy who was a vegetarian, and I'd asked him why, because you take a job where you may have to kill people, and but he wouldn't eat meat. And he was like, well, he worked in a Sara Lee slaughterhouse briefly, and says like the screams of the pigs was just too much. And like I mean, every now and again you'll see those videos. I know I have, where you see a video of like those PETA videos of undercover in a factory farm, and see the conditions, and then you say, well, shit, man, I'm supporting this by buying meat or whatever. And there's kind of like that, I don't know, I think there's like a Maude and Bailey going on, where you can point to something like that, that's an extreme, but then there's this whole thing smuggled in with the Peter Singer morality of equating humans and animals, where it's not pro animals, let's improve the lot of animals, so much as it is anti-human, and it's motivated by this hatred of humanity. It's like, who are we to put ourselves on this pedestal? There's nothing fucking sacred about us. Like, you should just debase yourself by having sex with the animal. Like, I think there's a spirit like that behind this whole thing, even to bring up the subject of having sex with animals.
Don't eat animals. Fuck them.
Yeah, it's not even about like, we're gonna make the lives
I'll
of
sell the
animals
meat
better.
locally,
Like,
sell it next door.
yeah. Well, and that's funny. Just a side note with that Ayatollah Khomeini's remark. I remember hearing people talking about Morrissey. Well, like the Smiths back in the 80s. It's like, I don't know, Morrissey's this kind of vegan animal rights guy. But I remember hearing like, oh, Morrissey is he's basically MAGA, England's version of MAGA now. He's this far right winger. Like, that was the thing. I said, that's kind of weird. I mean, not that I have a problem with it. It's like, as we've seen with the stuff going on in Ireland, it's like, yeah, there's a good thing about putting your own people in your own country, like, interests up there.
Morrissey is the most based vegan ever. Morrissey is the most based vegan who's ever lived.
Yeah.
I don't understand him, but like, it's true what you're saying. Like, continue. Like, it's weird though, right? Because it's just sort of like, you wouldn't expect that.
Well, but the thing is, though, it's like,
dude
people
is
would
based.
say that he was like,
those who would point to a certain other mid-century vegetarian who's probably like, not going to go there.
Well, but here's the thing with Morrissey, though, is like, when people would say this about him, oh, he's this far right winger. He's like, basically MAGA, and in England he's pro Brexit. He's all this stuff, and then I find out that, like, well, the reason for that was just basically this issue of the way halal meat is slaughtered, and he didn't like that, and he didn't like the way Islamic attitudes towards animals are, and so that's why he's anti this sort of globalization and the Islamification of Britain. And I'm like, that really changes. I mean, again, not to say that I would have had a problem if he was just like, hey, British people or the English are being replaced, or I guess he's Irish even. So it's like, we're being replaced, if that was his rationale. But instead, it's like the way it's misrepresented, it's like they put this argument out there and don't even characterize or frame his position properly anyway. So it's just kind of like that. I feel like there's a lot of that with this.
The media mischaracterizing people's positions.
Anyway.
When did that happen? I don't know if you guys saw, but and it's just a quick interjection. NS Lyons, the China convergence guy, we talked about his essay a few months ago. So like, there was a hit piece in the Atlantic about all the Nazis, the Nazi problem on Substack, by this guy Jonathan Katz, and in like one of the footnotes, because he mentions NS Lyons, who, if you read the China convergence, I mean, I'm pretty sure, like, he's not a card-carrying member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. I'm just going out on the limb, But Katz was like, Yeah, so no one knows what the initials NS stand for, but in right-wing circles, like NS is frequently used as an abbreviation for National Socialism.
Yeah, say
Just
Yeah,
what
put
you
that.
want
that
about
was
National
hilarious. Yeah.
Socialism, dude. At least it's an
Oh,
ethos.
it's just like
Oh,
Exactly.
when I read that, I was like, just that this can't be, you know.
Yeah.
it's
But
just the
the level of
disingenuousness of
stupid
these
is,
people.
yeah.
But like,
I think,
yeah. So we should wrap up soon. So
yeah, I just had
one thing that I wanted
one
to kind of
oh no, yeah. Do you want? I've
yeah.
got 1.2. Do you want to go first,
I think
or
I
do you
can
want to
be
wrap up?
fairly quick. I think yeah
Okay.
yeah we should wrap up soon. So let's make our final points.
Okay.
Yeah, so like with the whole thing about the law and the kind of personal touch in it, I think in our society, I think a lot of it comes down to like what are the metaphors, the ambient metaphors that are kind of like instinctively applied. And in our society, it tends to be the machine. Like the law is a giant machine, the economy is a giant machine, politics is a giant machine, and the impetus that we always have, which connects in a weird way to the kind of Descartesian shrinkage of the human as an element, is to remove the human as much as possible from the operation of the machine, with the result being that you ultimately have this giant, complex, lumbering machine operating without any human input whatsoever as the kind of ideal that we're more or less unconsciously always trying to implement. And bringing in AI into that discussion is pretty easy as well, because like of course that's the whole idea with AI is like, oh, we'll just like eliminate human agency entirely. We'll just all be the machine running itself, and this will be perfect. There won't be any room for human error. It will all be completely fair, and also completely inflexible and blind and stupid, because it will never be able to see when maybe the rules should be bent a little bit, because like the specific situation, whether we're talking law, whether we're talking in you know in the workplace or whatever, like should that it would it would be unjust to apply the law as written. Like when you remove the human element, it's impossible to um, impossible to recognize those situations where justice requires that the law be ignored, right? Uh, and yeah, just final thought that just occurred to me actually is like, with the Pauline Christianity, right? Where like his whole thing was like um, moving beyond blind following of the law, because once you've sort of found the spirit of God, like you can intuit what justice is in a given situation without just kind of like mechanically reading what the law is.
Mhm.
Um, and this is something which only humans can do. I don't think animals can do that at all. So
Mhm.
just to connect it to that, that's all I really want to say.
So I just had one thought, that specifically this is in reference to the death penalty, is that it doesn't seem like the issue is any particular law and whether that law goes in one direction or the other. Not necessarily, but that it's something, it's that the laws, well, that is almost irrelevant compared to something else, which is, I don't know if we've come up with a name for it, but I'll give an example, because you can have a country that has the death penalty on the books and one that where the death penalty is forbidden. And yet, if you look at the state in both cases, um, they don't care. If there's no death penalty, and if the state wants someone dead, they're going to do it off the books. Um, and the law be damned. You can have a country that doesn't officially have a death penalty, and the state organs will still assassinate someone. They'll still find a way to kill them, whether abroad or domestically. And so that issue is kind of that practice will happen regardless of the form of the laws. And I think so that's a sign that points to there being something else, something deeper, something just something else in addition to or underlying the law that is the problem. And I think this might kind of get to some of the things that Mark was saying about this. That I think all of us have been talking about. We've mentioned like technocracy and the kind of giving over our responsibility to an external source, whether that be like the state or something else. So I just think that there's probably a much bigger and longer discussion we could have about this that would get into all kinds of other facets of human life, because even when it comes to the particular laws, you know, that's one discussion, but what people actually do is a whole nother one. That's all I had to say.
Which bringing up is kind of, you know, reminds me of how President Obama got this Nobel Peace Prize, and then drone strikes American citizens like shortly thereafter. But no, you know, it goes to like the heart of moral reasoning and these kind of like these different articulations people have had, you know, whether like Kantian deontological ethics or like utilitarianism or natural law or, you know, virtue ethics or whatever, and just kind of like how none of them capture the whole thing. They all kind of point towards some reality beyond them and but each one of them, if you take them to just in isolation as to an extreme, I mean, they'll lead to some extreme places where you're justifying kind of stuff that doesn't really seem moral. And so, you know, with like utilitarianism is one that a certain type of person is very fond of, to the exclusion of other moral considerations. And, you know, you wind up with this sort of place where you justify having sex with animals, you know, but not eating them because, you know, you should have the same, an animal has the same moral worth, according to my utilitarian calculus. Rat has the same moral worth as a human boy, you know, so therefore it's like, well, but you know where that's going to lead is the human boy is seen as having no real moral worth, so why not kill him if he's a nuisance? So anyway, sorry, Luke, you probably are more eloquent than me.
No, I just wanted to wrap it up because I think we have illuminated quite a few aspects of this whole issue. So it was really good. And yeah, I mean, just about the utilitarianism, I think it's like very attractive to a certain type, and it's like a pretense, you know, that you can reduce ethics to something like very straightforward and manageable, and that's the attractive illusion about it, right? And that's what is its appeal. And to my mind, you know, the more I think about morality, it's like I always come back to this issue that it's really something that has like an infinitely deep context, right? It's obviously like you have to have rules and stuff for functioning society, but that's more or less a utilitarian thing, right? You just have to do that because otherwise it doesn't work. But when it comes to like, you know, like this moral decisions, it's like, yeah, it's just doesn't work according to hard and fast rules. That's what I think. Anyway, thanks everybody for listening, and hope to see you soon, hopefully next week, for another tonic discussion.
And remember, kids, don't have sex with animals.
Yeah, and thanks, by the way.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
And one final note.
Sell the meat to the neighboring village. That's
one final note, because I was I was looking at a quote from St. Francis of Assisi. If you have men who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you will have men who will deal likewise with their fellow men. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen,
good.
We'll see you later.
See you later.